Hello, my name is David O'Donnell, and I am a friend of Teramoto Sensei. And we have decided to work together to look at some of the articles on India that she is presenting to her class at Keio University's Shonan Fujisawa campus. I'll be teaching at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, Meiji Gakuin University, and Bunkyo University. And I will also use some of these materials that she recommended when I'm introducing students to Indian culture and history. So this is just an experimental video. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a think aloud reading of the article that she gave to me. I've not read the article yet. I'm just going to read it in a very natural way and have some musings about it. I will give my opinions and ask some questions out loud. So it'll be a reading practice exercise, a listening practice exercise, a critical thinking exercise, if it works correctly. That's what we're hoping for anyways. This is just a first try, so please be patient. I have known Teramoto Sensei now for several years. I used to be on the faculty of Keio University's Kankyo Joho English section, and I really enjoy the people and culture of Keio so much. So I'm really grateful that I can participate, even in this small way, in an English section class. So without further ado, let's take a look at this article that Teramoto Sensei has given to me. Indians in Japan by Mukesh Williams. Hey, I know him. He was also a faculty member at Keio Shonan Fujisawa campus, and he is a very dear friend of mine. So I'm very happy that I get to read this article from him. It's not the first article of his that I've read. He's a very good writer and a very interesting guy. I hope that Teramoto Sensei can introduce you to him at some point. He is Indian, but he is quite the expert in American literature and history. So sometimes he schools me in my own culture, which I think is wonderful. But anyways, let's check out this paper, Indians in Japan. The paper is part of an ongoing research project by Professor Mukesh Williams, Keio University Shonan Fujisawa campus, and Ms. Ui Teramoto, SOAS, University of London, who is also the co-author of this paper on the Indian communities in Japan, based on both archival and oral sources. The authors may be contacted at the following email addresses. So what year is this from? I'm curious, because I don't think Mukesh Sensei is still teaching at SFC. I think he's retired from that. And of course, Teramoto Sensei is now at Shonan Fujisawa campus, not the University of London. So yeah, this is from a little while ago. So it's really interesting. A little view into the writing and research past of Professor Teramoto and Professor Williams. So let's check it out. The Indian communities comprising of Sindhis, Keralites, Bengalis, Tamilians, and Punjabis living in Japan over the last 130 years have grown to nearly 23,000 today and occupy a wide range of professions from real estate and electronics to cuisine and information technology. So far, this is very interesting. I'm trying to think. Yes, I believe I have known someone from each of these communities in the past. After I graduated from college, I knew a very nice Indian man. His family lived in Jamaica, but he was a Sindhi Indian. And Keralites, a former student of mine was from Kerala, and there was a wonderful Indian restaurant in Osaka that was owned by a Keralite. Bengalis, I can't think of the exact person that I knew, but I'm so sure I've known Bengali people. And Tamilians, I've known quite a few of people from Tamil Nadu and also from Sri Lanka, where one of the languages is Tamil and Tamilian people live. And Punjabis, I have known a few, including having met one or two in Sanganjaya, near where my family lives. Punjabi Sikhs. Okay, so let's continue. The lackluster performance of capitalist American business in the recent past has generated a renewed interest in Asian trade networks centering on business families of the 19th and early 20th century. Both economic historians and sociologists are eager to investigate colonial and post-colonial trade networks and the demography connected to agricultural labor and professional elites in British-occupied territories and the Anglo-American world. Wow, that's a very intense sentence. Mukesh writes, and co-author Teramoto Sensei write with great erudition. They write in a very educated way. And if you're a returnee student, if at SFC or a level C student, maybe you can understand this very easily. But if you're someone who's only studied in Japan and hasn't yet had the opportunity to read a lot of academic text, this might be a little bit hard to parse because it's giving really a lot of information, very densely packed in. So these two groups, economic historians and sociologists, they want to investigate colonial and post-colonial trade networks. So India was colonized by the British, as China and Taiwan were colonized by the Japanese, and America was colonized by the British, and Taiwan was colonized by the Portuguese. And once the colonial period has ended, when a people regain their independence, we often refer to that as the post-colonial period of that country and culture. And in terms of India, there's quite a lot of post-colonial literature research. That's a whole subgenre of English literature where people study the writings about overcoming colonialism and moving on from colonialism. And sometimes how language and literature transition from the period when the colonists were there to when they left. Specifically in India, the study of Shakespeare is fascinating. I had a friend who did a doctorate in post-colonial literature, and she focused specifically on how Shakespeare was taught in India, and it was fascinating. But here we're talking about trade networks, so things that worked during the colonial period when the British had a very strong foothold in India to when they left. These trade networks would have changed. And the demographics is like the study of the people and the cultures of the people and the movements of the people from one area to another area. A person who studies demography is called a demographer, and it's a kind of social science where people study these things. So to understand the trade networks, it's very important to understand the demography connected to agricultural labor and professional elites. So it would be very useful to know about the Sindhis, Keralites, Bengalis, Tamilians, Punjabis, etc., because it might be different. These different groups might have different ways of interacting in the present and historically. So wow, it's a very, very complex article. Okay. Another great word here is lackluster. This is actually kind of putting down my my home country, the lackluster capitalist American business. Lackluster means not impressive. It lacks luster. Luster means shininess or standing out in some way. If something is lackluster, we could say it's mediocre. It is not exceptional. So these people, the economic historians and sociologists, are eager to investigate colonial and post-colonial trade networks and the demography connected to agricultural labor and professional elites in British occupied territories and the Anglo-American world. So the English-speaking world. We now say that English is a lingua franca. It is the connecting language, the shared language of many peoples around the world. And of course, England is the origin of the English language, and the American dialect and the Canadian dialect are centered in those countries. But English is spoken in many places, and England was a colonist to many countries, and we could say America was kind of an economic colonist, if not an actual old-fashioned style colonist. It was it has a presence many places in the world. So kind of understanding these complex relationships is something that's very important for um, the movement and progress of the modern world. The pioneering work of Indian trade communities in the Far East, especially in Japan, Singapore, and China during the 19th century, has remained rather neglected. So when they're talking about the neglect, they're talking about the research about it. So these trading communities have existed, and um, we haven't studied them as much as we should. And if we study them more, we can understand better how they work, and that'll help us to decide what to do in the future. I think Teramoto Sensei will correct any mistakes that I may make, and I may make many. This is a think aloud. This is just me wandering through, having my thoughts, just as you'll wander through and have your thoughts. There are many reasons for this neglect. A Eurocentric bias in academic research, linguistic difficulty, a lack of demographic data, and discontinuous histories of trading families themselves have all resulted in a disinterest in this area. Wow, such great vocabulary. So Eurocentric, meaning the mentality is kind of centered around the European region and European context, and people are not focusing on other areas and other contexts. A bias is the kind of leaning or sort of prejudice that you have against something. This is really a big shift from the article, but one of my favorite professors when I was in New York was a fellow named Professor Bond, and he was a really eccentric guy, and he talked a lot about bias, and he said that you should announce your bias. In fact, he would come into the classroom and throw his books on the desk and shout, "Announce your bias!" Don't trust anyone who says they have no biases. Everyone has biases, and it is our ethical responsibility to understand what our biases are and to let people know about our biases. What things kind of affect the way that we see the world and the way that we act within the world. Doesn't mean we should be prejudiced towards other people, but if you grow up in America and you've experienced a certain culture, you may naturally approve or disapprove of certain things, even if it's not logical to do so. And those are your biases. And understanding those will help you to be a more impartial person in the end. But this is talking about a kind of bad historical, social, economic bias where people only focus on the European aspect of things. So the academic research is biased towards looking at Europe. There's linguistic difficulty, right? What does that mean? Well, possibly people speak different dialects of the same language, and it's hard to understand, speak and write different dialects, but also very likely people speak different languages. So if I am so interested in studying about Keralites and the Keralite context, I don't speak native dialects of the region of Kerala, or Hindi, which perhaps people in Kerala speak. And yeah, I'm not even sure of the specific dialect that might exist there or the specific separate language that might exist there. So those would be linguistic difficulties. It's hard to penetrate into those fields because you don't speak the language, or it's a different dialect of the language. Yeah. A lack of demographic data. You don't know the language, and maybe you don't even know what people are involved. You're not sure about who they are, and if you're not sure who they are, you won't know what language they speak, and it's really hard to communicate with them and research them. And discontinuous histories of trading families themselves. So maybe the family didn't keep good records. My own family doesn't have great personal records. I cannot tell you who my great-great-grandfathers were, or my great-grandmothers, and so on. So that can affect research if there's not good histories. And if people are involved in immigration to a different region, if they're part of a diaspora, when people of a certain culture spread around the world, in those cases, sometimes the family histories and personal histories get broken. People don't keep as close records. If you live in the same village for many generations, maybe you can ask anyone in that village about that family or that business. But when you move to a whole new city and culture, it becomes more and more difficult. And all of these different things have led to a disinterest in this area. So people have kind of maybe thought it's not interesting or it's not easy to research, so they kind of ignore it or haven't paid it the proper interest that it deserves. It is a neglected area. That's a word you'll hear often in research, like a certain aspect of research is being neglected. The Indian presence in Japan goes back to the 6th century when Indian culture and practices traveled along the Silk Route via Korea, China to Japan. This phase is usually referred to as a first phase of Indian immigration to Japan. In 736, the Buddhist scholar Bodhisattva, I wonder if that's what we sometimes call Bodhidharma or Dharma in China or Japan. I reckon it might be. Came to Japan on the invitation of Emperor Shomu to spread the teachings of Buddhism and Sanskrit learning. Oh, maybe not then, because Bodhidharma is semi-mythical. Like, I'm not sure they really know he existed, but this sounds like this is a really documented case of someone coming. So maybe Bodhidharma and Bodhisena were different people. Please ask Teramoto Sensei. There was a man on Fushimi Hill in Nara who never spoke, and people thought he was dumb. However, when he saw Bodhisena, he said, "The time has come," and began dancing with joy. Bodhisena lived in Nara in the Dianji in Heijokyo and died on February 25th, 760. He was buried on Ryojusen Mountain. This history has not been investigated enough, though we know from recorded oral histories in Japan that Bodhisena did commendable religious work in Japan. However, the impact of this early contact with India was tremendous. This is super interesting. Is this, okay, so he went to Nara, a place quite famous for spiritual matters, I think. The spread of Indian culture, of course, I'm not an expert in it, but I quite like martial arts. I like karate a great deal, and anyone who studies about karate knows that karate came to Japan via Okinawa. And in Okinawa, which had a very strong trade relationship with China, the native Okinawan martial art, which at the time was called Te, I believe, mixed with the Chinese Kung Fu, and this developed into what is now modernly known as karate. However, it's possible that it originated in India, because it's actually believed that Bodhidharma brought the Buddhist faith to China, and he also brought martial arts and taught them. I believe the story was that the Chinese people that he tried to teach did not have the strength to do the austerities of the kind of meditation that he wanted. So he wanted to build their strength, and he taught them martial arts to do so. So it's quite possible, though some people think of karate as Japanese, people who study karate think of it as Okinawan, influence from China. Maybe it even goes back further to India. And if you want to see something very interesting, go onto YouTube and look up Keralite martial arts. There's actually quite extraordinary martial arts from Kerala, a fantastic martial arts tradition where incredibly muscular and acrobatic people wearing loincloths, almost naked, jumping around with swords in a beautiful display of martial skill. And that may possibly be part of the origin of Kung Fu and Karate. So that's kind of interesting. So the impact of this early contact with India was tremendous, but the impact of India in general is tremendous. And if I'm not mistaken, it's a very hard to see in this picture, I believe we see Teramoto Sensei here. And here is Mukesh Sensei. So It's absolutely wonderful. I'm so sure I've seen at least two of the other people in this picture, I think. Okay, the spread of Buddhist doctrines, Sanskrit learning, the introduction of Hindu gods such as Ganesha and Brahma, and food habits became a part of Japanese traditions. It is believed that the Japanese scholar Kukai, 774 to 835 CE, I'm sure you've probably learned from Teramoto Sensei or already knew earlier, CE stands for the Common Era. We used to say BC and AD, but that actually dates the world in in a kind of Eurocentric way, because it uses Christianity to date time, BC being before Christ. Technically it wouldn't be Eurocentric, because though we think of Christianity as a largely European religion, it's actually originally from the Middle East. So, but in modern times, though we still, start at year zero, and now we're in 2022 as I record this, it would be too inconvenient to completely change the dating system. What would we do? We could use the ancient Jewish one, we could use the Japanese one, or other ones from around the world. But just as English has become a lingua franca around the world, the dating system has kind of been accepted around the world. So rather than have it be focused on the birth of the supposed birth of Jesus, they just changed it to CE and BCE. So before BC meant before Christ, but BCE means before the Common Era, and CE means the Common Era. So this is 774 AD, we would call it, if we use the old dating system. Okay. It is believed that the Japanese scholar Kukai, 774 to 835 CE, studied Buddhist doctrines through Sanskrit, and this gave impetus to the formation of kana syllables. This I did not know. Wow. So there's an argument that the kana syllabary came from Sanskrit, which was used for the practical purposes of studying Buddhist doctrines. That's so cool. Let's talk about this, Teramoto Sensei. I want to know more. It was predominantly through Indian encounter that the Japanese incorporated rice, lentils, and vegetables in their diet. It is also during the 16th century that cotton cultivation was introduced into Japan through India, transforming Japanese trade patterns and commerce. But the Gujaratis and Marwaris were more interested in cotton trade and not in settling down in Japan. This is interesting for me. My wife, who is Japanese, worked for a nonprofit organization in Japan that actually worked to fight child labor in India in the cotton industry. So the cotton industry is so famous and rich, rich in diversity. I don't know, rich in wealth, maybe rich in wealth too, in India. But now it is a place where there's significant troubles with child labor. The culture accepts that children should work really young. And my wife's former employer used to do outreach and do educational and economic assistance to try and stop child labor in the cotton industry. But it's so interesting that cotton was introduced to Japan through India. Interesting. So it's all kind of circular in a way that in my mind, like cotton came from India to Japan, and then in the 21st century, my wife, who is Japanese, worked to help the cotton industry back in India. Kind of amazing world we live in. But the Gujaratis and Marwaris, Gujarat is a place that I know a tiny bit about. I don't know anything about the Marwaris that I can think of, but Gujarat has a religion. I mean, I don't know if it stems from there, but in Gujarat there are many Jains, and Jainism is a very ancient peaceful religion. And yeah, there's a kind of proscription against hurting any living creature. And we often think of Hindus as really respecting life because of the sacredness of cows, but also of vegetarianism and so on. But the Jains seem to take that exceptionally seriously, the idea that you should cause no harm in the world. One of the first Indian people I ever met in my life was a Gujarati Jain, and she is the person who studied post-colonial literature and is now a Shakespeare expert in America. But the Gujaratis and Marwaris were more interested in cotton trade and not in settling down in Japan. So though there was religious and economic interaction in the 6th and 16th century, a recognizable Indian community had not taken roots in Japan. Interesting. So they interacted, but they didn't settle. They didn't really integrate or assimilate into Japan at that time. Both countries remained rather ignorant of each other. It was only in the 19th century, as India became colonized by the British, that Japan began to study India, fearing its own loss of freedom through European imperialism. Interesting. So European imperialism spread around the world. Like Belgium was in Africa, in the Congo. And one reason why one of the primary languages in the Congo region is French is because of the Belgian imperialism there. And Japan, had its closed status forced open by America. And there would be a fear of imperialism, of being taken over or being, in a sense, invaded, if not militarily, culturally, and economically from the outside, when in Japan at that time, the government was not accepting of that kind of, not accepting of interaction. No government is probably accepting of people taking over, but I can understand how imperialism would really be on the minds of people in Japan in that period. And it's interesting that Japan began to study India because India was being affected by imperialism, by colonialism. Interesting. Early in colonial migration, the Indians first came to Yokohama in the 1870s as silk merchants who set up the business of importing cotton yarn from India and exporting silk yarn and textiles to India. During the 19th century, Japanese textiles were seen as highly sophisticated and cheap, accounting for a major share of Japanese exports. Since Osaka emerged as the great textile centers in Japan. Centers in Japan, okay. Many Indians came here. A Bengali housewife, Hariprasad Takeda, wrote a 64-page travelogue entitled Bongomohilar Japan Jatra, a Bengalese lady visit to Japan. It's interesting. So did she marry a Japanese? Because Takeda is not an Indian name. Very interesting. Detailing her experiences in Japan and her visit to the country in 1915. However, the real influx of Indians took place in the 1950s and 1960s when Indian businessmen began to see Japan as the center of sari production exported to India via the United States, or fine spun cotton or black synthetic silk exported to Dubai. Okay, let me parse this down a little bit. However, the real influx, the real coming of Indians took place in the 1950s and the 1960s when Indian businessmen began to see Japan as the center of sari production exported to India. So the sari were being made in Japan and exported to India, but to India via the United States. So it was made in Japan, went to America, and then went to India. I'm not sure I'm understanding that correctly. That sounds very unlikely to me, but I don't know much about international trade. So it could be. Or fine spun cotton or black synthetic silk exported to Dubai. Okay. Interesting. The modern Indian settlements were set up by trading communities from India in the Kansai region, especially Kobe and Yokohama. Here, Punjabis, maybe this is supposed to be you, Gujaratis, unless there's another people called Gujaratis. I think Gujarati maybe, and Sindhis began to use their business skills, worked hard, and in due course became successful. However, for the Japanese media and the public at large, India continued to remain enmeshed in the stereotype of being a curry rice poor country. Oh, that sounds so racist. It's like a racial stereotype of the culture. Not to say, not to accuse people of being racist, but yeah, it wasn't a sophisticated or diverse view of the country and culture and languages and people. In the last decade, this image has changed. Only in the last decade? Oh my goodness. More and more Japanese see India as an IT and 20 by 20 country. So IT is information technology. I know that, but I'm not sure what 20 by 20 is. I'm going to have to look that up later. Trade and remittance. The early migration of Indian trading communities to Singapore and Japan in modern times was motivated by an absence of remittance facilities in colonial Britain. Remittance was necessary for the growth of domestic import and export transactions. Though colonial Britain made banking reforms to integrate India in the global economy in the 19th century and neglected global remittances, which were organized then by local Indian organizations and families. Early scouting visits by Indians to Japan were meant to assess the Japanese market potential and use Japan as a base for export. Since there was no state-sponsored organizations or help, the trading history of this period has been rather discontinuous. An understanding of the Indian trade communities of the 19th century comes from oral histories, diaries, and sketchy demographic records. This is very hard for me to understand. The whole idea that there's kind of a lack of a certain banking element. Like when you remit something, you pay something. And sometimes the bill for something, especially a service that you get, it's called like a remittance. So remittance was necessary for the growth of domestic import and export transactions. Yeah, you had to pay for things. Though colonial Britain made banking reforms to integrate India into the global economy in the 19th century, it neglected global remittances, which were organized by the local Indian organizations and families. So somehow, sorry, something from my teeth. Somehow, part of my dinner, a part of the banking system was kind of left out and was still kind of done in an old-fashioned local way by small organizations. So that's, I don't understand it deeply, but it seems like there was a kind of limit to the depth of the economic connection between India and other countries for some reason. Freedom struggle and Japan. Japan's own aspirations to design the East Asia prosperity sphere. I feel like that's something that I should know what it is, but I don't know what that is. It's just some kind of economic designation that or goal they were shooting for. And the desire of Indian revolutionaries like Rash Behari Bose, 1886 to 1945, to free India from British colonial rule brought together the Japanese nation and the expatriate Indian community to oust the British from India. Well, so Japan played a strong role in getting the British out of India. The Japanese nation and the expatriate Indian community. So like the Indians living abroad, presumably in Japan. Interesting. I had no idea they were so politically active. Recent archival sources discovered by the authors shed ample light on the early struggles of Rash Behari Bose in creating the Indian Liberation Army in Singapore. The support of Prime Minister Tojo and the later schism between Captain Mohan Singh of the IIL and Rash Behari Bose. Both Tetsuko Higuchi's own account, daughter of Rash Behari living in Tokyo, and Japanese secret agent Iwachi Fujiwara's 1908 to 1986 testimony reveal that Mohan Singh's own ulterior motives and his desire to undermine Rash Behari's singular efforts created bitterness between the Indian National Army and its Japanese supporters. Fujiwara also blamed Japanese simple-mindedness in assuming leadership roles concerning INA without consultations with their leaders. Okay, this is something that needs disambiguation from Teramoto Sensei or William Sensei, who understand it much better than me. So Yeah. So you have to be careful, like when you read something. Williams and Teramoto Sensei aren't um, aren't saying that the Japanese were simple-minded. Of course, what they're doing is they're this is kind of reported speech where it is a claim of um, uh, yeah. So it's Fujiwara who blames Japanese for simple-mindedness. So it's Fujiwara's criticism about their own um, country's interactions in this case. But this is a very pointed criticism. It's a very sharp criticism. Please don't refer to someone's arguments or actions as being fueled by simple-mindedness. It sounds very harsh. So obviously Fujiwara was very disgruntled or upset by it. Okay, I thought this was going to be a 20-minute video. This video is really going to be much longer. Hopefully, it's actually recording. It'll be so sad if it didn't after all this reading. Okay, Tetsuko Higuchi has always been troubled by this conflict. She naively confessed in her book Chichibose 2008, and though she wanted to visit India, she was worried that the remnant soldiers of the INA, once connected with her father, might create problems for her if she visited India. In the 1960s, her daughter visited Chandanagar, where Rash, a little bit of something moved around in my mouth. I'm so sorry. Where Rash Bahari was born. Tetsuko was able to visualize Chandanagar through the pictures and stories her daughter brought back from India. Indian expatriate communities. The tension between a place of migration and a place of residence, that is, between home and abroad, has created a distinctive Indian expatriate community in Japan. The Indian settlements began with religious and economic ties between the two countries and now embrace the progressive politics of both nations. Today, most Indians living in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kobe, such as Mr. Lingam, Chandru Advani, and Mr. Lund, are building new bridges of understanding between the two nations. Indians have not only been able to adapt themselves to the singular uniqueness of Japan, but also helped acquaint Japanese society to Indian business techniques, cuisine, and education. Now it is possible to see Indian electronics stores, real estate offices, restaurants, and schools in Japan. I'm not quite sure who all of these people are. I believe this is the first mention of them. So I imagine that this article is part of a larger work where these people and their efforts and impact are explored more. But I'm so sure Teramoto Sensei can expand on that for you. Although Indian economists and sociologists were interested in the remarkable recovery of Japan after World War II, they were not much interested in Japan per se, which was linguistically and ethnically quite different. Yeah, I should say so. All this has changed in the last decade. Both Japan and India are now interested in each other's histories and economies and are conducting large-scale cooperative business ventures. I feel like we should say, yay, because it sounds like a really positive thing. Indians have been quick to understand Japanese business ethics based on trust and hard work instead of handwork. Sometimes there's like a typo that gets by editors. That'll happen in Harry Potter as well as in academic essays. Business trends change, and sari and textile traders are branching out into new avenues, such as Indian movies, electronics, and real estate. Today, Indian shops abound in Kitano-cho area, and apartment buildings bear Indian names. Some Indians have also opened restaurants and eateries in Japan. Many, I think, by now. Indian traders feel that they ought to fill the gap in Japanese markets rather than compete with the Japanese themselves. Could be a thought there, I think. Okay. The Indian family. The Indian family in Japan is not a single unit, but bound by caste, religion, and ethnicity. I believe that caste is supposed to be abolished in India, but I also believe that in reality it still exists. To pronounce a judgment on its change and stability would be difficult in this limited space. However, suffice to say that though family ties are strong within the Indian communities, cross-cultural or hybrid marriages are beginning to be accepted. Indian families still retain their Indianness, but their children are more bicultural and bilingual. The second generation Indians fluent in both Japanese and English has created a new hybridity and yet they resist homogeneity. They possess what Gloria Anzaldúa calls heterogeneous identities, comfortable in multiple worlds. Some have Japanese spouses, while others do not. They see Japan as their place of birth and are more strongly tied to their Japanese neighborhood than to any Indian city. The role Indian women play in the expatriate communities is also changing. Wedged between two conservative cultures, Indian women are now forging out as business entrepreneurs, fashion designers, and market managers. Again, I feel like this is a point where we should be like, yay! It just sounds like a really good thing. Conclusion. A lot of archival material dealing with Indian presence in Japan in the 6th to 16th centuries, and then from the 19th to early 20th century, is primarily in Japanese language. It is usually not acceptable either to Indian or Anglo-American scholars. It is usually not accessible. I think I said acceptable. I meant to say accessible. This complex but significant work will bring into perspective the early history of Indian religious and trading communities in Japan and their efforts at creating a cultural confluence. Confluence means coming together of things. It could be of understanding. It could be of peaceful relationships. Today, the strong demand for Indian technology professionals, business entrepreneurs, hoteliers, and teachers is helping expand the Indian community more quickly. Some years ago, like 15 years ago or something, when I was in Japan, the Indian teaching method for mathematics was all the rage. Like on Japanese television, they were talking about how Indian schools had developed a better way to do math, a more efficient way to do math. So people became very interested in those developments. Okay. But behind this new interaction hides the history of centuries, which is almost forgotten. In the past, Japan eagerly introduced Indian religious and linguistic cultures into the country. Now, in a globalizing world, Japan needs to expand its global reach, and India too must open business opportunities to Japanese companies by relaxing legal and trade restrictions. The Indian and Japanese expatriate communities in both countries can be instrumental in bringing about this change. So interesting. And we can get more by Mukesh Williams if we click on that. And we have some really nice comments here. Even one by one of the authors, Mukesh Williams. He's so polite. Thank you for the enlightening comment. I'll have to read through all of the comments. Yeah, a wonderfully insightful article. I wish I could say I understood everything. These are not my fields. It's not my culture, though I'm fascinated with it. But yeah, it really seems to want to shed a light on the important historical relationship between India and Japan, how Japan has learned a lot from India, Indian people and Indian culture, and how it continues to this day, and how the presence of Indians has grown over the years in Japan, and their respect within the Japanese mainstream culture seems to have grown as well. So yeah, that was a bit of a babbly little video by me. Oh gosh, and I didn't realize I'm only looking at where my camera is now. I think most of the time I might have been like this. I'm so sorry. That must have been creepy. I'm filming this on an app, and I wasn't looking at myself as I was recording. I was looking at the documents. So sorry if that was creepy. Yeah, I don't know if this is of any use to Teramoto Sensei, or if I can use in my class, or if you'll enjoy listening to it. But it was just nice to read this, to see what you guys are studying in class, to give it some thought. I want to give it more thought. I hope that I can join one of your classes in person or virtually, so that I can get your own opinions and hear what Teramoto Sensei herself has to say. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this records. I hope you enjoy it. It's almost an hour long, 45 minutes long. In less than 30 seconds, it's going to hit the 45-minute mark. Okay, please take care. Be safe in coronavirus. Go have some delicious curry. Study hard. Be nice to each other.